key concept of building info management. I'm really hoping that I'm going to give you folks the seeds or the ideas to take away and empower information management in your work and your organizations. So here we go. So the concept of BIM, the vision of BIM, encapsulates all these different things, 5 of them there. And I remember when I sat down with a past CIO of mine, and we sat down during an intro talk and spoke about how do our organizations function. And what was said at the time was, and I sort of agreed really, was it's about people, it's about process, and it's about tech. Well, that's only 3 things. You can see we've got 5 here. And I think the most important thing to take away here is that tech and data are separate. And actually, I think AI is going to make tech less and less relevant and put more and more weight on the data. But what BIM is saying is that to get a really collaborative organization that is collectively working effectively with information, you need to get all 5 of those working correctly. Many organizations have got 1 or 2 of those functioning correctly, but you need them all working and you need the right balance between them. And if you can do that, you will get that BIM culture. For me, BIM is a culture. It's a way of behaving, a way of working, a way of thinking and seeing things. And the good news is that BIM aligns with all these things which are very relevant to the social housing sector. The Housing Ombudsman, which has got increased regulatory powers these days, put out a report, I think it was last year, called Knowledge Information Management, really looking for improvement in how the social housing sector does that. BIM delivers there. In fact, you've even got the Kim BIM thing going on, which makes me think they were half thinking BIM when they were talking about it. There's the new regulatory consumer standards from the regulator that were launched last April, which now require a much better understanding of one's housing stock and also a much better understanding of our customers, more data, and then making sure that we're understanding how our homes are actually delivering for the needs of our customers. So BIM is aligned to that as well. The National Housing Federation Code of Governance requires us to be able to grasp our information, and the regulatory standard on value for money needs us to be efficient and effective. And information management, I think, currently it's holding us back. It's a constraint on efficiency. And so BIM offers an opportunity to improve value for money. And also BIM aligns with the lean project change methodology. And then finally, anyone who's aware of the net zero transition, what that means for built assets, is probably aware that we need to understand a lot more about our homes. We need to sort of pre-design them and think about how they're going to be thermally efficient. We need to think about how they're going to be angled towards the sun, how that's going to heat them up. And then there's also going to be much more compliance for quality control when we build new homes. But then also for retrofitting, we need to understand more about our homes. So BIM is really giving us the tools to answer all of these key requirements. But what we've seen, and again, I'm just harping back a little bit here to the problem, is that lots of organizations launch projects, many projects that are information related. However, they're not really joined up. They haven't really grasped that actually the big picture here is BIM. And actually, it's that joined up culture and how do we pull it together so we've got that one collective version and culture that's working for the whole of the organization. So that's the BIM vision. And now we're going to look at the first key concept. Okay, there are 4 key concepts that I want to explain to you today. The first one here is understanding the life cycle of our assets. On the left there is the twinkle in the eye of the development director. I've got to build a scheme. So I'm going to build a scheme. That's all I know. This many units in this location. So he then has to go, he or she, I should say, has to go through a process of working up those plans. And it's interesting. I don't know if anyone here has seen it, but there's a thing called the RIBA schedule of works, which is a fairly widely accepted standard for the building, the planning and the building of properties. Very, very structured, really helpful tool. And it's a very structured process. And what you can see in that left-hand part of the screen is this rapid growth of information as that design process and build process is happening. So to start with, I'm just building potentially 40 units. Now I know whether they're going to be flats or homes. I know if they're going to where their windows are going to be. Oh, now I've gone through the phase of working out the wiring, whether they're going to have lifts, what sort of windows. And you can see that information growth growing rapidly, but in that lovely staged process along the bottom. And that amount of information rapidly growing. And that lighter green is there to demonstrate its project. It's a project, it's build, it's change. Now, this is a really, really, really important interface. This is where the properties have been built and they're now being handed over to operations to actually put people inside the homes. It's that handover. And what you see on the other side then is the slightly darker green. So this is your BAU information that sits in our housing system. It's not changing. It's got this many homes. This is the address, et cetera, et cetera. It's the standard information that's not changing. But you can see a little bit of light green there. There's a little bit of project work that does keep going. And it's that project work which is leading to this more gradual growth in quantity of information. And that's because things do happen throughout the life of an asset. It might be that we want to extend them. It might be, and this is something very relevant to Mike, we might want to go and fit new fire doors to them. That's going to be a new project. There's going to be new information related to that. It might be that we need to revalue the properties or risk assess them. So there will be growth in information over time. And it's not structured anymore. It's not this lovely structured approach. It's much more based on certain triggers. Certain thing happens and it triggers the need for a project. And so that's the nature of that information growth, all the way up to the point that you're actually selling or disposing of that property. One of the issues is that you often find that this information handover doesn't happen. And actually, there's a big jump downwards and a sort of discontinuity. And that's where development simply haven't handed over the information that's needed for the operations team to fully operate their assets. And what happens is that operations are forever chasing their tails for the information that they need. So that's the concept of life cycle. So now we know that we're going to have to consider the life cycle of our asset, and just think how long an asset lasts from build. It could last, a building could be up for tens of years, if not 100 years. Hopefully that will be the case. And as we've explored through that concept of the life cycle, many different people are going to engage and need to have information related to that asset to fulfill their responsibility. So let's just look at that. BIM's got this concept of information perspective. So the asset owner, so let's imagine the board here and the chief executive. They need to know how many homes they've got. Where are they located? They need to know what amount of profit their homes are making. Do their homes comply with the law? And what's the overall satisfaction with their homes? That's the owner's perspective. Now, think about all the teams that support that asset management, building safety. To be able to give the CEO and the board what they need to know a lot more granular information about the asset. Is there asbestos? Is there electrical fittings in there? How many rooms are there? Are there fire doors fitted? Is this disability friendly or not? So the asset owners need to know a heck of a lot more information. What's the value? It's not just physical aspects. What's the rent set against this property? Then there's the project perspective. These are the teams and the people who are building the new homes. So it's like, what's the goal here? What's my budget, etc. That's the project set. And then there's society more widely. So what's our reputation? Is there a sense that all these properties are actually safe to move into? What are our expectations of this housing organisation and the properties that it has? So lots of different perspectives to consider. And if you imagine, we actually need processes that actually consider what people's needs are at the beginning. As we're creating that information, we need to think, right, well, who's going to need it? Whose perspective are we collecting information for and we capturing that information for? So you then get to this point. You know now that you need to get a heck of a lot of information to properly be able to operate your assets. So you've got a specification. You've specified this is the information that I'm going to need so that this organisation can manage its homes effectively. Right, well, how are we going to get that? Where's that information come from? Who's going to provide us with that information? Where's that information going to go once I've got it? It's not going in a filing cabinet. It's got to go somewhere in a digital system. So we've then got to plan for the delivery of that information. And then we need to go through to the actual delivery of that information. So as the project is delivered, that information needs to be produced and prepared for handing over. So that really is a critical consideration. And I'm now going to show you a diagram which shows you how all of this stitches together. And this is a process that we need to make fundamental in how our organizations operate. So there's the board, there's the CEO, this is what they need. There are our organizational information requirements. It's what the organization needs. Based on that, these are the asset-related information requirements, the more detailed aspect. Now that we know, we've broken down, we've said, right, the organization needs this, we've gone through a process to work out at the asset level, then this is what we need. We know all the information that we need now. Let's now make sure we've actually got somewhere to put that information. And so we have our asset information model. This is sort of touching a little bit on Chris's question, does this go in one piece of software or does it go in numerous pieces of software? It doesn't really matter. It just has to go somewhere, and we have to have a blueprint for how we keep all of our asset information to make sure we've got everything that we need. And that's what we call our asset information model. Now, we have the projects that kick off, the building of the house or the fitting of fire doors. So the organization tasks off a project team. I want you to go forward and build a scheme of 40 properties, or I want you to go and fit fire doors. Here's your task. Here's your budget. The project team then needs to understand, well, okay, that's very outlined, that objective. I now need to understand at a more granular level what information I need. It has exchanges with the asset teams and works out in much greater detail what information is required for it to deliver the project. As the project progresses, that information is collected. So let's imagine Mike is fitting 3,500 fire doors. Okay, so what are the properties that he's fitted them in? What type of fire door was fitted? Which door of the property was it fitted in? When was the last inspection done on that fire door? When will the next one be done? Have the customers been informed? So a heck of a lot of information will be gathered during that project. And that is called the project information model. And this is where things so often fall down. That project information isn't then added to the asset information model, and therefore the business is left in a deficit and doesn't have the information it needs to manage that asset going forward. So let's just look at the old layer cake and see what's happening in the old way of looking at things. So along the top there, this is what the organization needs. This is how we fulfill our responsibilities in our processes and our policies. And from there, this is the information that we're going to need in our asset information model to deliver our services and procedures. Now we need to deliver change. So we're talking strategy. So we're going to do something differently. We're going to increase the number of homes. We're going to fit fire doors. And so there may be a need for new data elements in our asset information model. And so that's going to be needed to be added. And this cycle happens time and time again. This is the critical cycle that we have to build into our businesses, into our organizations. So whenever there is a project, no matter how small it may seem, and here up on the screen is a list of triggers that the BIM standard actually quotes. Take a look through. You will recognize, many of you will recognize these types of process: asset replacement, new asset, change of ownership, risk assessment. These are all things that are happening every day in a housing organization, and they need to be seen as triggering a project. What does the project need to do? What are the information requirements? Getting those information requirements from the asset information teams, gathering that information, and then making sure it's added to the asset information model. And we've got to have like a highway in our business where this feels absolutely instinctive. So that's the second concept I wanted to get to you. Now, the third concept, and this is about information exchange. So we've looked at the life cycle. We've looked at all the different people that are involved in information over the life cycle. Now, I did mention that BIM was originally coming from the sort of development side, the building of homes. And this diagram particularly demonstrates that in a way where the housing provider or the purchaser of the new homes is at the centre and then has a lead contractor who's going to build those homes for you. The lead contractor might have some subcontractors who may have subcontractors, and there may be a few other contractors involved in getting those homes built. But whether it's building new homes or actually just the teams within an organisation that's going to fit the fire doors, for example, there is going to be a lot of exchanging of information. We've developed our specification. So this is the information we need. We've done our analysis of the OIRs and the AIRs, the asset information requirements. There's our spec. This is what we're going to need, lead contractor. This is what we're going to need, fire safety team. Off you go. And then as the project progresses, the information is exchanged with us. And we need to make sure that that really high risk scenario, because this is where it goes wrong, is where we don't get what was specified. It's not correctly handed over. It was ill-defined, or it wasn't handed over, or it's corrupted, or it doesn't work in our systems. And this is where there needs to be checks. So the party that's about to do the exchange needs to have a set of systematic checks. The information is handed over, it's exchanged, and once we receive it on the other side, we also have to do our checks. And this way, we take the risk out of exchanging information. And if we just take a little pause now, if we think about what's happening in an organization and the problems that we face, it is all about the exchange of information, isn't it? It's about collaboration, and collaboration is about information being handed between people. And so this really is a fundamental part of protecting our data quality and the integrity of our information. On to the fourth and final key concept of BIM. And this is about the common data environment. And as we've said, we've got our specification. Information needs to be worked up, and you'll have individual teams doing this. They might be doing it on their own little piece of software. They might be doing it on an Excel spreadsheet. Who knows? But once they do that, it needs to be handed over, and there needs to be deconfliction to make sure it actually meets the expectation of all those other parties that have got a stake in it, to make sure that there's no conflict and this actually meets the requirements. So before those individual teams hand that information over, we need some thorough checks before it goes public to make sure the right information is being handed over. That goes into the shared space. That deconfliction process happens. Any conflicts are sorted out. There might be some iterations of new data. And then, right, we're ready to go and publish. Now, publishing, if you're building a house or a home or a scheme, publishing might be publishing to a contract, actually getting the contract out. So large amounts of money and legal terms being set out. If you're fitting the fire doors and you're in the operational side of the business, then this might be putting the data into your core operating system. Once it's out there, it's in the core operating system, anybody could be calling on that data, it's published, it needs to be right. And so you want some governance checks there as well to make sure it's absolutely right before going live and making that big investment and that big step. And the idea is that if you do that, you maintain the integrity of the flow of your data around your organization. And the archive there is for those iterative steps to be able to evidence the conversations and the responsibilities that have been exercised throughout those iterations of data. Now, that's the concept, but actually, how do we deliver it? Well, what it talks about, all these little bits of information, the BIM standard calls them containers. So it goes right down to the most granular layer. It might be, what tap are you going to be fitting in this property, or what fire door? It's absolutely granular, but then it builds up. So it might be, what home is it, or what scheme is it, or what estate is it? But everything has got its container and is defined. It's got like its own address, so we know where everything is stored. The second thing we do is we rely on the federation strategy. Now, this is what knits it all together. Now, if you've got a smart piece of software, I think that'd be more in the development world, really, rather than social housing. It might do it for you. But in the operations side, in social housing, where we've got lots of different digital platforms working for us, we have to deal with what we've got. And the reality is that we've got many different systems and they need to work together. So this federation strategy is those processes and rules that we need to abide to make sure things are moving around the business correctly. For many of us, as we start our journey, it's going to be a manual process, but that can still be specified in a process. And hopefully, as our data engineers get their way, they will automate these processes for us, but just whether it's a computer or a human, there needs to be clear steps, clear processes, and clear rules abided by. So that's a great important piece of work there that enables our information to be part of that common data environment, or the CDE as they call it. And the good news is that there are data standards that help us with much of this, particularly with the containerization of information. Now, in the development world, there are national standards for how you break a home down into the various different bits and pieces. But what's really interesting, and I'm hoping Neil's going to touch on this a bit later, is that actually there is work underway to develop social housing standards. So we don't always have to define all these containers and data elements ourselves. We can actually call upon a standard. And Chris, you were talking about interoperability. I'm hoping that these data standards will actually enable social housing providers. They'll all be working on the same definitions. And so we'll be able to work with other social housing providers. We'll be able to work with contractors. It will really take a lot of the pain out of collaborative working. So what I'm suggesting then is that those four concepts will create the vision, and that with these concepts that use people-friendly terms will take away those barriers, and they will empower our colleagues to really engage with a modern vision for information management. And then we will end up with hopefully a marriage made in heaven between people and computers. I've been trying to push this concept of the significance of this digital information. We must stop seeing computers as tools that we pick up, and we must start seeing them as partners. Human roles have been replaced with IT and digital systems, and we almost need to imagine those computer systems next to us wherever we're working, and make sure that we are using the language that they need to be able to deliver on our behalf. And you can stitch all of this together. The BIM standard does a wonderful job of this. As you can see, all those key ideas have been brought together. But really, just to finalize those key concepts, then we need that vision. We need to make it instinctive. Employees need to be talking, thinking, and acting BIM. We need to be thinking about the full life cycle of our assets. What is all the information we're going to need to be able to operate and then meet our compliance and performance needs once our assets are operational? And then that idea of really identifying those information requirements at a granular level at the beginning of any project, and then making sure that is added to the asset information model. If our data engineers aren't able to set up our model to hold that information, we're not going to have anywhere to put those requirements. And making sure that the project information is added as said. We need to de-risk our information exchanges. We've got our specification now. We need to make sure there is careful checks to make sure we're getting what is expected and managing those standards. And then finally, that concept of the CDE, the common data environment. This is how we enable that flow of information, federating our different containers so that we get that one single version of the truth. Now, we might not be able to do it for everything at once. It might be there's only a small amount of data that is in our CDE. But over time, we can discipline, manage our data, create those rules, create those processes, and hopefully bring more and more into that common data environment through the federation of the digital estate. Ideally, automatically where we can, but if not, manual will do.